The rain hammered against the windows of the community center as Marcus Thompson sat in the back row, his worn jacket pulled tight around his shoulders. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the room filled with about 30 people. Most were young veterans like himself, though some showed the gray hair and weathered faces of those who had served decades before him. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in the plastic chair, his leg aching from an old injury that never quite healed right. He hadn't wanted to come to this meeting. The social worker at the VA hospital had been persistent, though, insisting that the veteran support group might help with his transition back to civilian life. 3 months since his discharge, and Marcus still felt like a stranger in his own country. The meeting leader, a middle-aged woman named Sarah, was going through the usual introductions when the door at the front of the room opened. A tall man in his 50s entered, wearing a crisp military uniform with the silver eagles of a full colonel on his shoulders. The casual chatter in the room died down as heads turned to look at the newcomer. "Sorry I'm late," the colonel said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to command. "I'm Colonel James Hendricks. I was asked to speak with your group today about some new programs we're implementing to help veterans transition into civilian careers." Sarah nodded and gestured to an empty chair at the front. "Of course, Colonel. We were just doing our usual check-ins. Please, have a seat." Marcus studied the colonel as he settled into his chair. The man's uniform was immaculate, his posture perfect even while sitting. Everything about him spoke of a successful military career, probably never having to worry about where his next meal was coming from, or whether he could afford rent. Marcus felt a familiar bitterness rise in his throat. The check-ins continued around the room. Veterans shared their struggles with finding work, dealing with nightmares, adjusting to civilian life. Some talked about family problems, others about financial difficulties. Marcus listened with half an ear, his attention drifting to the rain still pelting the windows. When it was his turn, Marcus simply said, "I'm Marcus. Still looking for work. Things are challenging." He kept it brief, not wanting to air his problems in front of the colonel. Colonel Hendricks took notes throughout the session, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. When the formal part of the meeting ended, he stood and addressed the group. "I want you all to know that what you're going through is real, and it's valid," he began. "The transition from military to civilian life is one of the hardest things any of us will ever face. But you're not alone, and there are people and programs designed to help." He went on to describe various initiatives the military was developing in partnership with civilian organizations: job placement programs, educational opportunities, mental health resources. Marcus found himself listening despite his skepticism. The colonel seemed genuine, not just reading from a script. After the formal presentation, the colonel moved around the room, speaking individually with veterans. Marcus was gathering his things, preparing to leave, when he felt a hand on his shoulder. "Marcus, right?" Colonel Hendricks stood beside him, his expression serious but kind. "I couldn't help but notice you seemed distant during the meeting. Is everything all right?" Marcus looked up at the older man, weighing his response. There was something in the colonel's eyes that seemed different from the usual bureaucratic concern he'd encountered at the VA. "Just tired, sir," Marcus said finally. "It's been a long few months." The colonel pulled up a chair and sat down next to him. The rest of the room was emptying out, veterans heading home to whatever situations awaited them there. "Tell me about your service," Colonel Hendricks said. "Where did you deploy?" "Afghanistan. 2 tours," Marcus replied. 2019 to 2022. "What was your MOS?" 11B, infantry. "Spent most of my time in Helmand Province." The colonel nodded. "Tough area. What unit?" 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry Regiment. 101st Airborne. ASPN. ASPN. SPN. AMEM. Colonel Hendricks leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus more carefully. "The Rakkasans. Good unit. Saw a lot of action out there." Marcus felt himself relaxing slightly. The colonel knew what he was talking about. Wasn't just making small talk. Maybe he'd actually seen combat himself. "What about you, sir?" Marcus asked. "Where did you serve?" A shadow crossed the colonel's face. "Multiple deployments. Iraq, Afghanistan. Started as a lieutenant in Iraq, back in 2003. Worked my way up. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Two soldiers recognizing something in each other that civilians rarely understood. Marcus, the colonel said finally, I'm going to be direct with you. I've been to a lot of these meetings, and I can usually tell when someone is struggling more than they're letting on. You strike me as a good soldier who's having a hard time finding his place in the world. Marcus felt his defenses rising. I'm fine, sir. Just need to find steady work. When's the last time you had a decent meal? The question caught Marcus off guard. He looked down at his hands, calloused from his time in construction work when he could find it. His stomach had been growling throughout the meeting, but he'd gotten good at ignoring hunger. I eat, he said quietly. Colonel Hendricks reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. There's a diner about 2 blocks from here. Best coffee in the city. And they make a hell of a burger. What do you say we continue this conversation over some food? Number, Marcus hesitated. He didn't like charity. Didn't want to be anyone's project. But something about the colonel's manner suggested this wasn't pity. It felt more like one soldier looking out for another. I don't want your charity, sir. It's not charity, Colonel Hendricks replied firmly. It's 2 veterans sharing a meal and some conversation. Nothing more, nothing less. After a long moment, Marcus nodded. All right. They left the community center together, walking through the rain toward the diner. The streets were mostly empty, the evening rush hour having given way to the quieter hours when the city belonged to night shift workers and insomniacs. The diner was a classic American establishment, all chrome and red vinyl booths. The kind of place that had been serving the same basic menu for decades. They slid into a booth near the back, away from the few other customers. A waitress approached with coffee and menus. Colonel Hendricks ordered a burger and fries. Marcus started to order just coffee. But the colonel interrupted. Make that 2 burgers, he told the waitress, and whatever pie you've got for dessert. When the waitress left, Marcus shook his head. Sir, I told you I don't need. Marcus, the colonel cut him off gently. Sometimes accepting help isn't about what you need. Sometimes it's about giving someone else the chance to do something good. Humor an old soldier, all right? They talked while they waited for the food. About the war. About the challenges of coming home. About the way civilian life never quite made sense. After you'd seen combat, Marcus found himself opening up more than he had in months. Talking about the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the way crowds made his skin crawl. The colonel listened without judgment, occasionally sharing his own experiences. It was clear he'd been where Marcus was now. Had fought his own battles with the transition. When the food arrived, Marcus realized how hungry he actually was. He tried to eat slowly, maintain some dignity. But the colonel seemed to understand and focused on his own meal. You know, Colonel Hendricks said between bites, I've been thinking about expanding some of our veteran programs. We need people who understand what our returning soldiers are going through. People who've been there. Marcus looked up from his burger. What kind of programs? Outreach, mostly. Going to meetings like tonight. Connecting with veterans who are struggling. It would be part-time to start, but it could grow into something more substantial. You barely know me, sir. Why would you offer me something like that? Colonel Hendricks smiled. Call it intuition. I've been around long enough to recognize quality when I see it. You've got the bearing of a good soldier. Even if life has beaten you down a bit. And sometimes the best people to help others are those who've been through the worst themselves. Marcus considered this as he finished his meal. The idea of steady work, of doing something meaningful, was appealing. But he'd been disappointed before. What would it involve exactly? Visiting VA hospitals, attending support group meetings, maybe some one-on-one mentoring. Nothing too formal to start with. Just being present, being someone that struggling veterans can relate to. And you think I'm qualified for that? I think you're exactly the kind of person who could make a difference. But there's something I need to know first. Marcus tensed slightly. What's that? Colonel Hendricks leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. I need to know I can trust you. Really trust you. This work, it requires someone with integrity. Someone who understands what it means to have other people's lives in their hands. How would you determine that, sir? The colonel was quiet for a long moment, studying Marcus's face. Tell me about your worst day over there. The day that still keeps you up at night. Marcus felt his chest tighten. Nobody had asked him that question before. Not directly. The VA doctors danced around it. The counselors tried to ease into it, but Colonel Hendricks had cut straight to the heart of it. Sir, I don't think... Marcus, I'm not asking as someone who's trying to fix you or analyze you. I'm asking as someone who's been there. Someone who understands that we all carry days that changed us. If we're going to work together, I need to know what you're carrying. The diner seemed to grow quieter around them. Marcus could hear the rain still falling outside, the distant hum of traffic. His hands were shaking slightly, and he pressed them flat against the table. There was a mission. He began slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. A village in Helmand. Intelligence said there was a Taliban commander there, planning an attack on our forward operating base. Colonel Hendricks nodded, encouraging him to continue. We went in at dawn. My squad was providing overwatch while the main force cleared the compounds. Everything was going according to plan until... Marcus stopped, swallowing hard. Take your time, the colonel said gently. There was a child. A boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old. He came running out of one of the compounds. And he was carrying something. In that split second, I had to decide if it was a weapon or a toy, or just something a scared kid was holding on to. Marcus closed his eyes. The memory as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. I held my fire. My training, my instincts. Everything told me to shoot. But something made me hesitate. And that hesitation saved that kid's life, because what he was carrying was just a wooden truck his father had carved for him. That sounds like you made the right call, Colonel Hendricks said. That's what I thought too, until 30 seconds later when the real threat came from a different direction. A Taliban fighter with an RPG, targeting the Humvee where my squad leader was coordinating the mission. Because I was watching the kid instead of scanning my sector properly, I didn't see him until it was almost too late. Marcus opened his eyes, meeting the colonel's gaze. I took the shot, got him before he could fire the RPG. But by then, he'd already spotted us, already called out our position. What should have been a clean operation turned into a 3-hour firefight. Casualties? 3 wounded from my unit, none fatal, thank God. But it was close. Too close. And all because I hesitated when I should have been doing my job. Colonel Hendricks leaned back in his chair, processing what he'd heard. Marcus, do you know what I hear when you tell me that story? That I almost got my brothers killed because I was soft. No. I hear about a soldier who had the wisdom to distinguish between a real threat and a scared child, and the skill to neutralize an actual enemy when it mattered. I hear about someone who carries the weight of responsibility for his team, even when he did everything right. Marcus shook his head. You weren't there, sir. You don't know. You're right, I wasn't there. But I know soldiers. And I know what it takes to make those kinds of decisions under pressure. What you're describing isn't weakness, Marcus. It's exactly the kind of judgment and character we need in the people who are going to help other veterans. They sat in silence for a few minutes, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Colonel Hendricks spoke again. There's something I want you to understand about the work I'm offering. It's not just about helping other veterans adjust to civilian life. It's about rebuilding the brotherhood that gets lost when we leave the military. Creating networks of support that go deeper than just job placement or benefits counseling. What do you mean? In the military, we look out for each other. We know that the person next to us has our back, and we have theirs. That doesn't disappear just because we take off the uniform. Or at least, it shouldn't. Colonel Hendricks pulled out his phone and showed Marcus a photo. It was a group of men and women, clearly veterans, standing together outside what looked like a small office building. This is our team so far. 12 veterans from different branches, different conflicts, different backgrounds. But they all have one thing in common. They understand what it means to serve, and they're committed to making sure no veteran has to face the transition home alone. Marcus studied the photo. The people in it looked confident, purposeful, like they belonged somewhere. The position I'm offering you would be based here in the city, Colonel Hendricks continued. Full-time hours, decent benefits, and the chance to make a real difference in people's lives. But more than that, it would give you a mission again, something to get up for every morning. And you're offering this to someone you met 3 hours ago? Sometimes, the colonel said simply. Sometimes you meet someone and you can tell they're exactly what you've been looking for, even if they don't see it in themselves yet. Marcus felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't felt in months. Hope, maybe, or purpose. It was a feeling he'd almost forgotten existed. What would I need to do to get started? Colonel Hendricks smiled. Show up Monday morning at 0800. I'll have paperwork ready for you to fill out, and we'll start with some basic orientation. After that, we'll see what develops. Just like that? Just like that. Unless you have any questions. Marcus had about 1,000 questions. But one rose above the others. Why me, sir? Really? What is it about me that makes you think I can do this? Colonel Hendricks was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. You want? The honest answer? Yes, sir. It's the way you carry yourself. Even now, even after everything you've been through, you still have the bearing of a soldier, not just someone who served, but someone who understood what service really means. And that story you just told me, about the kid and the difficult decision, that tells me you're someone who can see the bigger picture, even in the middle of chaos. I'm not sure I follow. Marcus, in our line of work, we're going to encounter veterans who are dealing with trauma, addiction, homelessness, despair, sometimes literally life and death situations. I need people on my team who can make good decisions under pressure, who can see the humanity in everyone they encounter, and who won't give up on someone just because the situation looks hopeless. The colonel leaned forward, his voice becoming more intense. That day in Afghanistan, you had a split second to decide whether to shoot a child or risk the safety of your unit. You made the right call, and then when a real threat appeared, you handled that too. That's exactly the kind of judgment and courage I need. Marcus felt the weight of the colonel's words. For months, he'd been replaying that day as evidence of his failure. To hear it described as evidence of his character was almost too much to process. I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of responsibility, sir. Nobody ever feels ready. But that's not what matters. What matters is whether you're willing to try, and whether you can learn from your mistakes along the way. The waitress brought their check, and Colonel Hendricks paid without ceremony. As they prepared to leave, he handed Marcus another business card. My direct number is on there. If you change your mind about Monday, call me. If you have questions between now and then, call me. If you just need to talk to someone who understands what you're going through, call me. They walked back out into the rain, which had softened to a light drizzle. The streets were quieter now, most of the city settling in for the night. Colonel, Marcus said as they reached the corner where they would part ways, I have to ask, what made you start this program? What got you interested in helping veterans transition? Colonel Hendricks paused under a streetlight, rain glistening on his uniform. For the first time that evening, he looked older, wearier. Because I almost didn't make it through my own transition, he said quietly. When I came back from my first deployment in Iraq, I was angry, confused, felt like nobody understood what I'd been through. I made some mistakes, hurt some people I cared about. If it hadn't been for a few people who refused to give up on me, I might not be here today. True. What happened? That's a story for another time. But the short version is that someone saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself, and they gave me a chance to prove it. That's what I'm trying to do for others now. Marcus nodded, understanding more than the colonel probably realized. Thank you, sir, for tonight, for the opportunity, for seeing something. Thank you for being willing to share your story. That takes courage. They shook hands, a firm military handshake that conveyed respect and understanding. Monday at 0800, Colonel Hendricks said. I'll be there, sir. As Marcus walked home through the quiet streets, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Anticipation for tomorrow. For the first time since leaving the military, he had a reason to get up in the morning, a mission that might actually matter. He didn't know yet that his entire understanding of who Colonel Hendricks was would change in just a few days. He didn't know that the man who had just offered him a lifeline carried secrets that would rock him to his core. All he knew was that someone had seen value in him when he couldn't see it in himself. And that was enough for now. The rain continued to fall as Marcus climbed the stairs to his small apartment. But for the first time in months, he didn't feel like he was drowning in it. Monday morning came faster than Marcus expected. He stood outside the office building at 0750, wearing his cleanest pair of jeans and a button-down shirt he'd borrowed from his neighbor. The building was modest, 3 stories of red brick with windows that needed cleaning, but it looked solid and professional. The lobby directory showed Veterans Transition Services on the 2nd floor. Marcus took the stairs 2 at a time, feeling a nervous energy he hadn't experienced since his first day of basic training. When he reached the office, he found Colonel Hendricks waiting for him with a cup of coffee and a stack of paperwork. Right on time, the colonel said with approval. How do you take your coffee? Black, sir. Good man. Come on. Let me show you around. The office was larger than it appeared from the hallway. There were 6 desks arranged in an open floor plan, with a conference room at one end and several smaller offices along the walls. Only 3 of the desks were occupied by people who looked up and nodded as Marcus passed. Sarah Martinez, Colonel Hendricks said, gesturing to a woman in her 30s with short dark hair. Navy veteran. 2 deployments to the Persian Gulf. She runs our financial counseling program. Sarah stood and shook Marcus's hand firmly. Welcome aboard. If you ever need help navigating the VA benefits system, I'm your person. Tom Chen, the colonel continued, introducing a lean Asian man with graying temples. Marine Corps, served in Iraq and Afghanistan. He handles our job placement and training programs. Tom's handshake was even firmer than Sarah's. Semper Fi. What was your MOS? Raider. 11B, Marcus replied. Infantry. Good. We need someone who understands ground operations. A lot of our guys come from combat arms. The third person was a tall black woman named Dr. Patricia Williams, an Air Force veteran who ran the mental health outreach programs. She had a warm smile and the kind of presence that immediately put people at ease. We're glad to have you, she said. James has told us good things about you. Colonel Hendricks led Marcus to an empty desk near the window. This is yours. Computer's already set up with the basics. Password is on that sticky note, and you'll change it after your first login. Marcus sat down in the chair, running his hands over the surface of the desk. It was strange to have a workspace again. A place that was specifically his. Now, the colonel said, pulling up a chair. Let me explain what your first few weeks are going to look like. We're going to start you with some basic training on our programs and procedures. After that, you'll shadow Sarah and Tom on some of their visits. Get a feel for how we interact with veterans in different situations. What exactly do I tell people about my qualifications? You tell them the truth. You're a combat veteran who understands what they're going through, and you're here to help connect them with resources and support. Sometimes that's all someone needs to hear. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus threw himself into learning everything he could about the organization. He discovered that Veterans Transition Services was more than just a job placement program. They provided comprehensive support for veterans struggling with every aspect of civilian life, from housing and health care to education and mental health services. His first field visit was with Sarah to a VA hospital across town. They were meeting with a Marine named Rodriguez, who had been medically discharged after losing his leg to an IED. Rodriguez was bitter, angry at the world, and convinced that his life was effectively over. Marcus listened as Sarah explained the various programs available, the financial support options, the adaptive technology that could help Rodriguez maintain his independence. But he could see that Rodriguez wasn't really hearing any of it. The anger was too loud, too overwhelming. You know, Marcus said quietly when Sarah finished her presentation. I met a guy in my unit who lost both legs to a roadside bomb. Carlos Vasquez. You might know him. Rodriguez looked up sharply. Carlos? Yeah, I know Carlos. How do you know him? We served together for about 6 months before his incident. Tough as nails, always talking about the motorcycle he was going to buy when he got home. Yeah, that sounds like Carlos. What happened to him after? Marcus smiled. He did buy that motorcycle. Modified it for hand controls. Last I heard, he was racing competitively and teaching adaptive riding courses for other disabled veterans. For the first time since they'd entered the room, Rodriguez's expression softened slightly. Really? Really. Point is, your story isn't over just because it took an unexpected turn. It's just different than what you planned. The conversation continued for another half hour, with Rodriguez gradually becoming more engaged and asking practical questions about the programs Sarah had described. When they left, Sarah was impressed. That was good work in there, she told Marcus as they walked back to their car. You connected with him in a way I couldn't. That's exactly what James was talking about when he hired you. Marcus felt a warm glow of accomplishment that he hadn't experienced in months. For the first time since leaving the military, he felt like he was making a difference. His next assignment was with Tom, visiting a transitional housing facility where several veterans were staying while they got back on their feet. The facility was clean but basic, clearly operating on a tight budget. Tom was there to conduct a group workshop on resume writing and interview skills. During the session, Marcus noticed one veteran sitting in the back corner, not participating. The man was probably in his 40s, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of 1,000-yard stare that Marcus recognized from his own mirror. After the workshop, Marcus approached him. I'm Marcus. Didn't catch your name. Peterson, the man replied without looking up. And before you ask? No, I'm not interested in whatever program you're selling. Fair enough. Mind if I ask what you did in the service? Air Force. Helicopter pilot. Combat missions? Peterson finally looked at him directly. Search and rescue. Afghanistan. Mostly. You? Infantry. Same theater. Same theater. They sat in silence for a moment, each recognizing something familiar in the other. You know, Marcus said, I hated these kinds of meetings when I first got out. Bunch of people trying to fix me, telling me everything was going to be okay if I just filled out the right paperwork. And now you're one of them. Marcus laughed. Maybe. But I'm still figuring that out. What I do know is that having something to do with my time, something that feels like it matters, has helped. Doesn't mean all my problems are solved, but it's better than sitting in my apartment staring at the walls. Peterson was quiet for a long moment. I used to save people, he said finally. That was my job. Pull them out of bad situations. Get them home safe. Now, I can't even save myself. Who says you need saving? Look around, man. I'm living in a halfway house. Can't hold down a job. Can't sleep more than 2 hours at a time without nightmares. If that's not needing saving, I don't know what is. Marcus nodded. You're right. That's tough. But maybe the problem isn't that you need saving. Maybe the problem is that you're trying to do it alone. Over the next hour, Marcus learned more about Peterson's story. The pilot had completed dozens of rescue missions, pulling wounded soldiers and civilians out of hostile territory. He'd saved countless lives, but the weight of the ones he couldn't save had gradually worn him down. The final straw had been a mission where his helicopter took heavy fire while trying to evacuate a wounded squad. They'd gotten everyone out alive, but Peterson had been so shaken by how close they'd come to failure that he'd lost confidence in his abilities. I started second-guessing every decision, Peterson explained. In the cockpit, hesitation kills people. My commanding officer grounded me after I aborted 3 missions in a row because I wasn't sure the landing zones were secure enough. Sounds like you were trying to keep people alive. Or I was being a coward. Hard to tell the difference sometimes. Marcus understood that feeling all too well. You know what's funny? The day I decided to get out, I was sitting in my bunk reading a letter from some kid whose father I'd helped evacuate after he was wounded. The kid was thanking me for bringing his dad home. And all I could think about was how close I'd come to not being fast enough, not being good enough. So what changed? I met someone who reminded me that the fact that I cared so much about doing the job right was exactly what made me good at it in the first place. By the time they left the facility, Peterson had agreed to attend Tom's next workshop and to consider applying for a job training program for aircraft mechanics. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a start. "You're getting good at this," Tom told Marcus on the drive back. "You have a gift for connecting with people. I just try to meet them where they are instead of where I think they should be." 3 weeks into his new job, Marcus felt like he was finally finding his rhythm. The work was challenging but rewarding, and he was starting to build relationships with his coworkers. Sarah had become a mentor of sorts, teaching him the ins and outs of navigating military bureaucracy. Tom included him in planning sessions and valued his input on how to approach different types of veterans. Dr. Williams had even asked him to assist with a few individual counseling sessions when she thought his presence might help establish trust with clients. Colonel Hendricks checked in with him regularly but gave him plenty of space to find his own way. Marcus respected the man's leadership style and was grateful for the opportunity he'd been given, but there were still things about the colonel that puzzled him. Sometimes Marcus would catch him staring out the window with a distant expression, as if he was seeing something that wasn't there. Other times, he would receive phone calls that clearly upset him, though he never discussed the details. One Thursday afternoon, Marcus was updating case files when he overheard part of a conversation between Sarah and Tom. "Did you know James before he started this program?" Sarah was asking. "Not really," Tom replied. "I knew of him, though. His reputation in special operations was legendary." Marcus looked up from his computer. "Special operations?" Tom glanced around to make sure Colonel Hendricks wasn't within earshot. "Yeah, didn't you know? Before he became a regular Army colonel, he was deep into Black Ops stuff. Delta Force, maybe. Or something even more classified. There are stories." "What kind of stories?" "The kind you don't repeat," Tom said firmly. "But let's just say that when someone with his background decides to dedicate their life to helping veterans, it usually means they've seen some things that changed them." Our man, that evening, Marcus found himself thinking about what Tom had said. It explained some things about Colonel Hendricks. The way he carried himself. The quiet intensity. The fact that he seemed to understand trauma in a way that went beyond academic knowledge. But it also raised new questions. What exactly had the colonel done during his time in special operations? And what had happened to make him choose this very different path? His curiosity was satisfied 2 days later, in the most unexpected way. Marcus was working late, trying to finish up some paperwork, when Colonel Hendricks emerged from his office, carrying a thick folder. "Still here?" the colonel asked. "Just finishing up the Rodriguez case notes. He started his job training program today." "Good. That's good work, Marcus. You should be proud." As the colonel passed by Marcus's desk, the folder slipped from his hands, spilling documents across the floor. Both men bent down to collect the papers, and Marcus couldn't help but notice that many of them were classified military documents, stamped with security clearances he'd never seen before. One document in particular caught his eye. It was an after-action report with several names blacked out, but one call sign was clearly visible. Hawk 8. Hawk 8, Marcus read aloud before he could stop himself. "That's an interesting call sign." Colonel Hendricks froze, his hand stopping midway to another document. When he looked up at Marcus, his face had gone completely white. "What did you say?" "The call sign. Hawk 8. I was just wondering what kind of missions." "Where did you hear that name?" The colonel's voice was barely above a whisper. Marcus pointed to the document in his hand. "It's right here on this report." "Why? Is there something wrong?" Colonel Hendricks slowly stood up, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "Marcus, I need you to tell me exactly where you encountered that call sign before." "I haven't encountered it before. I just saw it on this paper." "Think carefully. Are you absolutely certain you've never heard the name Hawk 8 before?" Marcus was beginning to feel concerned. The colonel's reaction was far more intense than seemed warranted by a simple call sign on a document. "Sir, What's this about? Colonel Hendricks was quiet for a long moment, studying Marcus's face as if trying to solve a puzzle. Finally, he seemed to make a decision. Marcus, I need to ask you something. And I need you to answer honestly. During your time in Afghanistan, did you ever participate in any classified missions? Anything involving special operations units? No, sir. I was straight infantry. We worked with SOF units a few times, provided security or backup, but I was never read into anything classified. Did you ever encounter a situation where you were involved in the rescue or extraction of American personnel from hostile territory? Marcus started to shake his head, then stopped. A memory was surfacing, something he'd buried so deeply that he rarely thought about it anymore. A mission from his second deployment that had been classified far above his pay grade. There was, one time, he said slowly. Colonel Hendricks leaned forward. Tell me about it. It was about 18 months before I rotated out. We got called in to provide perimeter security for a medevac operation. Some kind of black ops team had gotten into trouble. Needed immediate extraction. We were told not to ask questions, just to secure the landing zone and keep hostiles away from the birds. Go on. The whole thing was strange. We weren't given any details about who we were extracting or what kind of mission they'd been on. Just that there were American personnel who needed immediate medical attention and transport to Germany. Marcus closed his eyes, trying to recall details he'd tried to forget. When the helicopters came in, they brought out 3 men. 2 were wounded pretty badly. Unconscious. But the third? What about the third? He was walking, but barely. Covered in blood. Some of it his own, some of it not. His uniform was torn up. No identifying patches or insignia. But when the medics were loading him onto the helicopter, he looked directly at me. Colonel Hendricks was completely still, barely breathing. He said something to me. Marcus continued. I couldn't hear him clearly over the rotor noise, but it looked like thank you. And then one of the crew chiefs came over and told us that what we'd just seen was classified. That we were never to discuss it with anyone. Did you ever learn who those men were? No, sir. We were told it was need to know, and we didn't need to know. The mission reports just listed it as Personnel Recovery Operation, classified. I never heard anything more about it. Colonel Hendricks sat down heavily in a nearby chair, the color still drained from his face. Marcus, he said finally, I need to show you something. He walked over to a locked file cabinet in his office and returned with a different folder. From it, he pulled out a photograph. 3 men in military gear, their faces dirty but visible, standing in front of a helicopter. Do you recognize any of these men? Marcus studied the photograph carefully. 2 of the faces were unfamiliar, but the third, that's him, Marcus said, pointing. That's the man who looked at me during the extraction. But sir, how do you have this photo? Colonel Hendricks set the photograph on the desk and looked Marcus directly in the eye. Marcus, my call sign during that operation was Hawk 8. I was the team leader of that special operations mission. And you were one of the soldiers who saved my life. The office fell completely silent, except for the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Marcus stared at the colonel, trying to process what he'd just heard. That's impossible, he said finally. You said your name was James Hendricks. It is. But during special operations missions, we don't use real names, even with each other. The man you helped extract that day was me. But you've never known me by anything other than my call sign until now. Marcus felt the world tilting around him. The man who had offered him a job, who had become something like a mentor over the past month, was someone whose life he had helped save years ago, in a classified operation that he'd never been allowed to discuss. The blood, Marcus said quietly. You were covered in blood. Some of it was mine. Most of it belonged to my team members who didn't make it out. Colonel Hendricks's voice was steady, but Marcus could see the pain in his eyes. We were a 4-man team sent in to gather intelligence on a Taliban leadership meeting. The operation went sideways, and we found ourselves trapped in a compound with about 30 hostiles between us and our extraction point. What happened? We fought our way out, but it cost us. 2 of my men were killed in the firefight. The third was wounded so badly that he died during the flight to Germany. I was the only one who made it home. Marcus remembered the weight of the moment, the intensity of the helicopter extraction, the way the wounded man had looked at him with what he'd interpreted as gratitude. "Sir, I had no idea. How could you?" The operation was classified at the highest levels. Even most of the people involved didn't know the full scope of what was happening. Colonel Hendricks paused, his voice becoming softer. "But what I do know is that if you and your unit hadn't secured that landing zone, if you hadn't kept those Taliban fighters from overrunning our extraction point, I wouldn't be here today. None of us would have made it out." Marcus felt a strange mix of emotions. Pride, certainly, at learning that his actions had saved lives, but also confusion, and a growing sense that this revelation changed everything about his relationship with the colonel. "Is that why you offered me this job? Because of what happened that day?" Colonel Hendricks shook his head firmly. "No, Marcus. When I met you at that support group, I had no idea you were one of the soldiers involved in my extraction. I offered you this position because I saw qualities in you that I thought would make you effective at helping other veterans. The fact that you were there that day in Afghanistan, that's just an extraordinary coincidence. But now that I know, it explains a lot about why I felt such an immediate connection to you. There was something familiar about your bearing, your demeanor. I couldn't place it at the time, but now it makes sense." Marcus stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening city. "This is a lot to process, sir. I understand. And I want you to know that nothing has to change because of this revelation. Your job, your role here, that's all based on your own merits. But everything has changed, hasn't it? I mean, I can't pretend that I don't know this now." Colonel Hendricks joined him at the window. "Marcus, there's something else I need to tell you. Something about why I started this program. Why helping veterans transition has become so important to me." Marcus waited, sensing that whatever the colonel was about to share would be significant. "When I came back from that mission, I was a wreck. Survivor's guilt, PTSD, depression, the whole package. I had nightmares every night about my team members who didn't make it out. I started drinking too much, pushing away everyone who tried to help me. I almost destroyed my career, my marriage, everything that mattered to me." The colonel's voice was steady, but Marcus could hear the underlying emotion. "I spent 2 years in that dark place, convinced that I should have died with my team, that I didn't deserve to survive when they didn't. It nearly killed me, and not from enemy action. From my own inability to accept help and find a way forward. What changed? I met a veteran from Vietnam who had been through something similar. Lost his entire squad in an ambush. Lived with guilt for 30 years. He didn't try to tell me everything would be okay. Didn't give me any platitudes about moving on. He just sat with me in that dark place and reminded me that the best way to honor my fallen team members was to live a life that would make them proud." Marcus nodded, understanding the profound impact such words could have on someone drowning in guilt and grief. "That's when I realized that the skills I developed in special operations, reading people, understanding motivation, operating in high-stress environments, could be used to help other veterans who were struggling with their own transitions. It became my new mission. And now you know that one of the people you're trying to help was there the day your team was lost." "Yes. And that knowledge makes this work even more meaningful to me. It's like completing a circle that started years ago in a helicopter landing zone in Afghanistan." They stood in silence for several minutes, both lost in thought. Outside, the city was settling into its evening rhythm. Traffic flowing through streets, lit by streetlights and neon signs. Finally, Marcus spoke. "Sir, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever think about that day? About how things might have been different if the extraction had gone wrong?" Colonel Hendricks was quiet for a long moment. "Every day. But not in the way you might think. I don't wonder, what if, about my team members who were lost. That kind of thinking leads to madness. Instead, I think about the responsibility I have to make sure their sacrifice meant something, to live a life that justifies the fact that I survived when they didn't. And you think this work, helping veterans, is how you do that? I think it's part of it. But there's more." He turned to face Marcus directly. "Meeting you. Learning about your story. Seeing the impact you're already having on the veterans we work with, that gives me hope that maybe there's something larger at work here. Maybe the fact that you were there that day, and that you're here now, isn't just coincidence. Marcus felt the weight of that suggestion. The idea that his presence during the colonel's extraction, and his current work helping veterans, might be connected in some meaningful way, was both inspiring and daunting. I don't know if I believe in fate, sir. Neither do I, necessarily. But I do believe that sometimes life gives us opportunities to complete stories that seemed finished, to find meaning in experiences that initially seemed like nothing but tragedy. As they prepared to leave the office, Colonel Hendricks handed Marcus the photograph of his special operations team. "I want you to have this," he said. "Sir, I can't take this." "These were your team members." "Exactly. And now you're part of that story too. You helped write the ending to their mission. Even if you didn't know it at the time, it seems right that you should have something to remember them by." Marcus accepted the photograph, handling it carefully. Looking at the faces of the men who had died, he felt a connection to something larger than himself, a sense of responsibility that went beyond just his new job. "Thank you, sir. I'll treasure this." As they walked out of the building together, Marcus realized that everything about his relationship with Colonel Hendricks had changed, but not in the way he might have expected. Instead of feeling awkward or obligated, he felt a deeper sense of purpose. He wasn't just helping veterans transition to civilian life. He was completing a mission that had begun years ago in a war zone, honoring the memory of soldiers who had paid the ultimate price. The revelation about Hawk 8 had transformed what started as a job opportunity into something much more significant. A calling, a way to ensure that the sacrifices of fallen warriors continued to have meaning through the lives they helped save. Walking through the quiet streets toward his apartment, Marcus understood that his story with Colonel Hendricks was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The weekend after the revelation passed in a blur for Marcus. He spent most of Saturday staring at the photograph Colonel Hendricks had given him, studying the faces of the men who had died during that classified mission. He researched their names online, finding obituaries that listed them simply as "killed in action," with no details about the circumstances. The weight of knowing he had played a role in their story, however small, settled on his shoulders like a familiar burden. When Monday morning arrived, Marcus wasn't sure what to expect at the office. Would things be different between him and the colonel? Would the knowledge of their shared history change the dynamic of their working relationship? He arrived early, as had become his habit, and found Colonel Hendricks already at his desk, reviewing files. "Good morning, Marcus," the colonel said, looking up with a slight smile. "How was your weekend?" "Quiet, sir. Did a lot of thinking." "I imagine you did. Are you okay with everything we discussed Friday?" Marcus sat down at his desk and powered up his computer. "I think so, sir. It changes how I see things, you know. The work we're doing here. My role in it. It feels more personal now. Personal can be good, as long as it doesn't become overwhelming. The key is channeling that connection into motivation, rather than letting it become a burden." Over the next few days, Marcus noticed subtle changes in how Colonel Hendricks interacted with him. There was a deeper level of trust, a willingness to involve Marcus in more sensitive cases, and higher-level planning discussions. It wasn't favoritism exactly, but rather the recognition of a shared bond that went beyond the typical supervisor-employee relationship. The first test of this new dynamic came on Wednesday, when they received a call about a veteran in crisis. The man's name was David Park, a former special operations medic who had been found in his apartment after what appeared to be a suicide attempt. He was hospitalized but stable, and his sister had reached out to Veterans Transition Services for help. "I want you to take the lead on this one," Colonel Hendricks told Marcus as they drove to the hospital. "Sir, I'm not sure I'm qualified for a suicide intervention. Dr. Williams would be better suited. Dr. Williams will be involved. But I think you might be able to connect with Park in a way that others can't. He's special operations, dealing with survivor's guilt from a mission that went wrong." Sound familiar? Marcus understood immediately. The colonel was trusting him with a case that hit close to home, believing that his own experiences and his newfound knowledge about the colonel's past would help him reach someone who was drowning in the same dark waters. The hospital was a typical VA facility. Clean but institutional, with the smell of disinfectant and the sound of overhead pages echoing through the corridors. They found David Park in a private room, staring out the window with hollow eyes. He was a small man, probably in his early 30s, with the lean build of someone who had been in excellent physical condition, but had let himself deteriorate. "David?" Marcus said softly, approaching the bed. "I'm Marcus Thompson. This is Colonel Hendricks. We're from Veterans Transition Services. Your sister asked us to come by." Park turned to look at them, his expression flat and uninterested. "More people trying to fix me." "Great. We're not here to fix you," Marcus replied, pulling up a chair. "We're here because we've been where you are, and we know how dark it can get." Something in Marcus's tone must have registered, because Park's expression shifted slightly. "You've been here? In the psych ward, after trying to kill yourself?" "Not exactly here, but in the same place emotionally, believing that the world would be better off without me, that I was a burden to everyone around me." Colonel Hendricks remained standing near the door, letting Marcus take the lead but ready to support if needed. "What changed?" Park asked. Marcus considered his answer carefully. "Someone reminded me that my story wasn't over yet, that the worst day of my life didn't have to define all the days that came after." Easy to say, when you're not the one who let your entire team down. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus glanced at Colonel Hendricks, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Tell me about your team," Marcus said. For the next hour, David Park told them about his final mission. He had been the medic for a 4-man special operations team tasked with gathering intelligence in a remote area of Afghanistan. Like Colonel Hendricks's mission, it had gone wrong quickly. Park's team had been ambushed, and in the chaos, he had made a decision that haunted him every day since. "Rodriguez was hit first," Park said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Gut shot, bleeding out fast. I had to choose between providing covering fire for the team and treating his wounds immediately. I chose to treat Rodriguez." "That sounds like the right choice for a medic," Marcus said. "While I was working on Rodriguez, Thompson got hit, then Garcia. By the time I looked up from Rodriguez, 2 more of my team members were down, and the enemy had closed the distance. If I had provided covering fire first, kept them at range, maybe Thompson and Garcia would still be alive. Or maybe Rodriguez would have died instead, and you'd be blaming yourself for not treating him." Park shook his head. "You don't understand. As a medic, my job was to save lives. But as a team member, my job was to help keep everyone alive long enough for the medic to do his work. I couldn't do both, and because of that, 2 good men died." Marcus felt the familiar weight of impossible choices made under impossible circumstances. "David, can I tell you about someone I know who faced a similar situation?" Park nodded, and Marcus began to share Colonel Hendricks's story, with the colonel's permission. He talked about a team leader who survived when his men didn't, about the guilt and self-destruction that followed, and about the long journey toward finding meaning in survival. "The person I'm talking about," Marcus concluded, "spent years believing he should have died with his team. It nearly destroyed him. But eventually, he realized that the best way to honor his fallen teammates was to use his survival for something meaningful, to help others who were struggling with similar burdens." "And where is this person now?" Marcus glanced at Colonel Hendricks. "He's standing right behind me." Park's eyes widened as he looked at the colonel with new understanding. Colonel Hendricks stepped forward and, for the next hour, shared his own story in detail. He talked about the mission, the losses, the years of darkness that followed, and the difficult process of learning to live with survivor's guilt. "I won't lie to you," the colonel said. "There are still days when I wonder why I survived when better men didn't, but I've learned that those questions don't have answers, and spending my life searching for them would be a waste of the gift I was given." "What gift?" Park asked. "The chance to make sure their sacrifice wasn't meaningless. Every veteran I helped transition successfully, every life we save through our programs, every family we keep together. That's how I honor my team members. That's how their deaths continue to have meaning." By the time they left the hospital, David Park had agreed to participate in an intensive outpatient program and to consider joining Veterans Transition Services as a volunteer once he was stabilized. More importantly, he had agreed to keep living, to see if his story might have chapters he hadn't imagined yet. That was exceptional work, Colonel Hendricks told Marcus as they drove back to the office. You reached him in a way that I'm not sure anyone else could have. We both did, sir. My story alone wouldn't have been enough. He needed to hear from someone who had been exactly where he was. Yes, but you set the stage. You created the trust that allowed him to listen when I shared my experience. That's a skill that can't be taught. Quote, the success with David Park marked a turning point in Marcus's role at Veterans Transition Services. Word spread quickly through the veteran community about the organization's effectiveness, particularly their ability to connect with veterans who had been written off as unreachable. Marcus found himself increasingly called upon for the most difficult cases, veterans who were dealing with severe trauma, addiction, and despair. Each case taught him something new about resilience, about the many different ways that people could be broken and rebuilt. There was Jennifer Santos, a former Air Force security specialist who had developed agoraphobia after a mortar attack on her base. There was Michael O'Brien, a Navy veteran who had turned to drugs after his best friend died in a training accident that O'Brien blamed himself for causing. There was Patricia Hamilton, an Army nurse who couldn't stop reliving the patients she had been unable to save. With each veteran he helped, Marcus felt his own understanding of trauma and recovery deepen. He began to see patterns in how people responded to impossible situations, how guilt and shame could consume someone from the inside, and how the simple act of being truly understood could be the first step toward healing. 6 months after the revelation about Hawk 8, Colonel Hendricks called Marcus into his office for what he said was an important discussion. Marcus, I want to talk to you about the future of this organization and your role in it. Marcus sat down across from the colonel's desk, curious about what direction the conversation would take. Over the past half-year, I've watched you develop into one of the most effective advocates for struggling veterans that I've ever seen. You have a natural ability to connect with people who are in crisis, and more importantly, you have the credibility that comes from having walked in their shoes. Thank you, sir. This work has become incredibly important to me. I know it has, and that's what I want to discuss. Marcus, I'm considering expanding our program significantly. Instead of just serving the local area, I want to develop a model that can be replicated nationally. Training centers, standardized protocols, a network of veteran advocates who can provide the kind of support we've been offering here. Marcus felt a surge of excitement at the scope of what the colonel was describing. That sounds incredible. How can I help? I want you to help me design and lead the program. You would be responsible for developing the training curriculum for new advocates, establishing best practices, and eventually overseeing the rollout to other cities. The offer was overwhelming. 6 months ago, Marcus had been struggling to pay rent and wondering if his life had any purpose. Now he was being asked to help create a national program that could potentially help thousands of veterans. Sir, I'm honored that you would consider me for something like this, but I'm not sure I have the qualifications. Marcus, let me stop you there. Your qualifications aren't found on a resume or a diploma. They're found in the lives you've helped save, the connections you've made, the trust you've built. David Park is back in school, studying to become a counselor himself. Jennifer Santos is working full-time and hasn't had a panic attack in 2 months. Michael O'Brien is 6 months clean and volunteers at a homeless shelter on weekends. Those are your qualifications. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility and opportunity settling on his shoulders. What would this involve exactly? It would mean traveling extensively, spending months at a time in different cities setting up new programs. It would mean speaking at conferences, working with government officials, probably some media appearances. Are you ready for that level of visibility and responsibility? Marcus thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. From a struggling veteran who couldn't find his place in the world, to someone being asked to help lead a national effort to support other veterans in similar situations. It seemed almost impossible to believe. Colonel, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think this would have happened if we hadn't discovered our connection? If you hadn't known I was there during your extraction? Colonel Hendricks considered the question carefully. I think you would have excelled in this work regardless. The connection we discovered certainly deepened my trust in you and probably accelerated your development. But your fundamental abilities were always there. But would you have offered me a position like this if you didn't know about that day in Afghanistan? Marcus, let me ask you a different question. Does it matter? We can't separate our shared history from who we are today. That experience, your experience helping save my life, my experience surviving when my team didn't. Those things are part of what brought us to this moment. Trying to figure out what would have happened in some alternate timeline is less important than deciding what we're going to do with the opportunity we have now. Marcus nodded, understanding the wisdom in the colonel's perspective. You're right. The question isn't whether I deserve this opportunity. The question is whether I'm willing to step up and try to be worthy of it. Exactly. And I believe you are. Marcus spent the next week considering the offer. He talked to Sarah and Tom, both of whom enthusiastically endorsed the idea. He spoke with Dr. Williams, who told him she had seen remarkable growth in his ability to connect with traumatized veterans. He even had a long conversation with David Park, who credited Marcus with saving his life and encouraged him to take on a role that could help save many more. Finally, Marcus made his decision. I'm in, he told Colonel Hendricks on a Friday afternoon as they prepared to leave the office. I want to help build this program. The colonel smiled and extended his hand. Welcome to the next phase of your mission, Marcus. As they shook hands, Marcus realized that the title the colonel had used was perfect. This wasn't just a job or a career opportunity. It was a mission, in the truest sense of the word, a purpose that connected his past service, his current struggles, and his hopes for the future into something larger than himself. The following Monday, they began planning in earnest. Marcus threw himself into researching best practices for veteran support programs, studying successful models from other countries, and developing training materials that could be used to prepare new advocates. Colonel Hendricks used his connections in the military and government to secure funding and political support for the expansion. As word of their plans spread, other veterans began reaching out, wanting to be part of the effort. David Park was among the first volunteers, followed by Rodriguez from the VA hospital and Peterson from the transitional housing facility. Even some veterans from other cities heard about the program and expressed interest in bringing it to their communities. 3 months later, Marcus found himself standing in front of a room full of veterans in Chicago, conducting the first training session for advocates in their pilot expansion city. As he looked out at the faces of men and women who had served their country and were now ready to serve their fellow veterans, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. It had started with a broken veteran sitting in the back of a support group meeting, ashamed of his circumstances and convinced that his best days were behind him. It had led through a chance encounter with a colonel who saw potential where Marcus saw only failure. It had included the shocking revelation that their lives had intersected years earlier in a war zone, connecting them through bonds deeper than either had initially understood. But perhaps most importantly, it had shown him that the most difficult experiences of his life, the trauma, the struggle, the sense of being lost, could become the foundation for something meaningful and powerful. His own journey through darkness had given him the ability to serve as a guide for others who were still finding their way. As he began the training session, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Colonel Hendricks, who was setting up a similar program in Denver. Heard from David Park this morning. He's been accepted into a master's program in counseling. Says he wants to specialize in trauma recovery for veterans. Thought you'd want to know. Marcus smiled as he put his phone away. David Park's journey from the edge of suicide to graduate school was perhaps the best validation possible for the work they were doing. It showed that redemption was possible, that the worst moments of someone's life didn't have to be the final word in their story. Good morning, Marcus began, addressing the room full of veteran advocates. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I want to tell you about a call sign that changed my life. He went on to share the story of Hawk 8, of how a chance meeting in a support group had led to the discovery of a connection that stretched back to a helicopter landing zone in Afghanistan. He talked about Colonel Hendricks, about the team members who had died in that classified mission, and about how their sacrifice continued to have meaning through the lives being saved and rebuilt by Veterans Transition Services. But most importantly, he talked about the power of one veteran reaching out to another, of the understanding that could exist between people who had shared similar experiences, and of the possibility that even the darkest chapters of their lives could become the foundation for hope and healing. When he finished speaking, the room was silent for a long moment. Then, one by one, the veterans began to share their own stories, stories of loss and trauma, of struggle and despair, but also of resilience and hope, stories that would become the foundation for a movement that would eventually help thousands of veterans across the country find their way home from the wars that had changed them. As Marcus listened to their stories, he understood that this was what Colonel Hendricks had meant when he talked about completing a circle. The mission that had begun in a war zone years earlier, that had cost the lives of brave soldiers, was continuing through the work they were doing now. Those fallen heroes were still saving lives, still making a difference, through the program that had grown out of their sacrifice. And Marcus, the infantry soldier who had helped secure a landing zone for their extraction, had become part of that continuing mission. Not by chance, perhaps, but by the kind of purpose that emerges when people are willing to transform their pain into service for others. The call sign Hawk 8 would always represent loss and sacrifice to those who knew its true meaning. But it also represented hope, redemption, and the unbreakable bonds that connect those who have served. When Colonel Hendricks had said that call sign in the Veteran Support Group meeting, it had indeed made the room go silent. But from that silence had emerged something powerful and lasting. A program that honored the fallen by serving the living, and a friendship forged in the crucible of shared service and mutual understanding. Years later, when Veterans Transition Services had grown into a national organization helping thousands of struggling veterans, Marcus would still carry the photograph of Colonel Hendricks's special operations team in his wallet. It served as a daily reminder that every life saved, every veteran helped, every family kept together, was a tribute to those who had paid the ultimate price for their service. The story that had begun with a broke veteran and a compassionate colonel had become something larger than either of them could have imagined. It had become a testament to the power of connection, the importance of understanding, and the possibility that even our darkest experiences can become the source of light for others who are still finding their way out of the darkness. And it all started with two simple words that changed everything. Hawk 8.